Well, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Home Recording Solutions, helping you to get professional radio quality music productions in your home studio. This is Dakota, and super excited today because we are talking about a very important topic, and that is EQ or equalization. And so the way that I'm going to be going about this is I'm going to be introducing an equalizer and what it does, and kind of show you some things about an equalizer and some of the things that are common to most equalizers. And then I'm going to walk you through the frequency spectrum and kind of give you an idea of what you can do with certain instruments to help enhance them in the mix and so forth. So let's go ahead and get into this. So EQ, an equalizer, is probably the most important tool at the hands of in the hands of the audio engineer. If I were only given one tool to mix a song with, other than rough volume balance with the faders, I would choose an equalizer because it is so powerful and so foundational, and it's very, very important. And that is why if you want to get radio quality productions in your home studio, you've got to understand how an equalizer works and how to use one properly. So what does an equalizer do? Well, an equalizer is basically a volume knob for frequencies. So basically, you've got, over here, we have our frequency spectrum all the way from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. And this is the range of human hearing. Humans can't really hear below 20, and we can't really hear above 20K. And so it's this range from 20 to 20K that we are primarily concerned with in music production. And what an equalizer does is that it allows you, it's basically a volume knob or a volume adjuster for different frequencies throughout the spectrum, right? So you can turn up frequencies or you can turn down frequencies. When you turn up frequencies, that's normally referred to as boosting or accentuating. When you turn down frequencies, that's normally referred to as cutting or attenuating. And so most of the time, most engineers refer to as a boosting and cutting. So those are some of the most common terms, but all it is turning up the volume or turning down the volume of a certain frequency. So it's very, very important because in a mix, you've got all these frequencies bouncing around from all these different tracks, and it's your job as the mix engineer to balance all these frequencies so that they work together, they gel together, and they complement each other, and they produce a mix that has definition, separation, and sounds like something that could be played on the radio. That is the goal. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to basically break this down a little bit more, and before we start walking through the frequency spectrum, talking about different instruments. But basically, we all know when it comes to frequencies, you've got your low frequencies. Those are the bassy tones. That's basically the bass, all right? And I would consider the lows to be from about 100 hertz and below. Okay, that's pretty much the low end in your mix. And then we have this range from about 100 to 500 or so, from about 100 to 500 or so, and that would be kind of your low mids. All right, so they're not quite as low as the lows, but they're part of the mid range, but they're part of the low mid range. And then we have this area from about 500 hertz all the way to about 5 kilohertz. And that's normally your high mids, okay? And so these are obviously, we're getting higher now in the frequency spectrum. And then from about 5K on up to 20K and beyond, that's really kind of considered your highs. Okay, that's the real high stuff. There's not a whole lot going on up here, especially once you get above 10K. But it's the really high stuff. It's the stuff that, you know, is the crispy sounding part of your song and certain instruments, the real high stuff, okay? So, you know, not trying to get scientific here, or at least not trying to get too scientific here, but frequencies, basically what happens is when a sound wave moves through the air, the faster that it cycles through its cycle determines its frequency. So sound waves that travel really slow through their cycles, we perceive those as being low frequencies. And sound waves that travel through their up and down cycles really fast, we perceive that as being high frequencies. And then we have everything in between, of course. And again, you don't have to be a physicist to be an audio engineer, but it does help to understand a little bit of science sometimes behind all this. Okay, let's talk about some of the most common tools you'll use within an equalizer. And so let's start off with the bell filter. Okay, the reason it's called a bell is because it looks like a bell. Sometimes these are called notch filters. These are the most common tools that you'll be using within an equalizer, and so it's important to understand what they do. As you can see, you can turn up or down certain frequencies that you need to adjust. And as you can see, you have the band point right here, which is the center, which is the highest part of what you're raising or lowering. But it's also affecting what's immediately around it. So for example, right now, I'm boosting about 5 dB at 300 hertz, but it's not just boosting 300 hertz, it's also boosting what's immediately around it. And the way that you can control how much it boosts or cuts around it, or how much it affects around it, is this Q knob down here. And your equalizer will have a Q. But basically the Q tightens this up or widens it out. And that just affects, again, the frequencies that you are affecting around the band point. If you tighten it up real tight, you're not affecting many frequencies around 300, but if you widen it out, now you're affecting a lot of frequencies around that band point that you set. And well, how do you know how to set this? Well, it's all about taste, and it's all about what sounds good. Okay, so do what sounds good. Most of the time you're going for somewhere sort of in the middle of something like, you know, that might look like that, where it's not extreme either way. It's just kind of, you know, it's bringing up what you want to bring up and slightly around it as well. So that's what the bell filter or the notch filter does. It's very important. And again, these are called band points. So these are bands. Okay, so we got our band here and we got our band here. And with this fab filter plugin, you can actually add, I think, up to 24 bands. Not that you would probably ever need that many on a track, but I still think it's cool. But anyway, so that's what that is. Now, let's talk about a couple of other tools here. Let's talk about the shelving filters. So the shelving filters, first off, we have our low shelf. And we can even adjust the Q on that. And this, I don't really like that's one thing about this plugin. I don't really like the knobs. You're kind of weird sometimes adjusting them, but it's still definitely worth getting. But so let's do a high shelf up here. Okay, so the shelving filters are cool. The way that they differ from the bell filters is that not only are they raising up a certain frequency at the point that you set, but it's also raising up or down every frequency either below or above that point, depending on whether you're using a low shelf or a high shelf. So a low shelf, look at this example. I'm boosting here. I've got my band point here at about 100 hertz, and yes, it is boosting a little bit above 100, but it's not just boosting at 100. Everything below 100 is being boosted. Okay, so whereas with the bell curve, only the immediate areas around that frequency point are being affected, but with the shelf, everything below it with the low shelf is being boosted. Same thing if you were to cut. Everything below it is being cut. And the high shelf is exactly the same. The only difference is that everything above that point is being raised or lowered instead of below it. That's why it's called a high shelf. And so those can come in handy sometimes. It's important to know about them. A lot of people like to use a high shelf, for example, at about 8K, somewhere in that area, to sort of give a gentle, 2 or 3 dB lift on a mix or on certain instruments, just sort of bring out that sizzle, bring out that sheen on the high end. So that can be nice to use. I have to be honest, I don't use low shelves a lot. I just don't. Normally, I'm going for more targeted frequency, so I'm using bells or I'm using this shelf to sort of bring out some sizzle on the high end. I don't use this a whole lot, but still this can come in handy. So that's the difference between the bell filter or the bell type tool here and the shelf, the shelving filters. Okay, now I'm going to delete these because we're going to do something else, and I don't know what I just did there. Okay, delete these. Now let's talk about a couple other things, then I'll start walking you through the frequency spectrum. So we have here our high pass filter. Okay, now the reason it's called a high pass filter is because it's rolling off everything below it, but it's passing everything above it. You can also refer to this as a low cut. That sometimes it's more helpful to think of it as a low cut. So you're cutting off all these frequencies down here. You can see it rolling it off until you finally end up cutting them out completely. And the high pass filter is so important because in a mix, when you've got drums and kick drum and bass guitar and all these different low end frequencies, they can really start to pile up really quick. And my suggestion to you would be to use a high pass filter on everything. That's right, everything except the kick drum and the bass guitar. Everything except the kick drum and the bass guitar and any other subsense that you might be using. Because here's the thing, you want to keep this low end reserved for the kick drum and the bass guitar. If you've got too many frequencies from all these other different instruments piling up down here, you're going to end up with a low end that is muddy, that lacks definition, that is sloppy, and you're just going to end up with a mess. So if you want separation and clarity in your mix, the high pass filter is your best friend. High pass everything up to about 100 hertz, maybe even more, to get all those other instruments out of the way of the kick drum and the bass guitar. And so you can also adjust the steepness of this slope. I generally like, right now we are at 12 dB per octave. I normally keep it there. You can go a little bit steeper if you want. I wouldn't really go above 18 dB per octave though. But as I said, this is your best friend. Use it. I use it all the time. I use it on everything except the kick drum and the bass guitar. And even on those, you can get away with using it a little bit, but don't dare run it up too far. Okay, keep it way down here. You know, roll off the really low stuff if you don't want it, but don't dare roll it up to 100 hertz or anything like that. Now, the low pass filter is the same concept. Okay, it's the same concept. The only difference is that instead of rolling off the low end, it's rolling off the high end. It's rolling off everything above. So it's called a low pass because it's passing the lows. You can also call this a high cut because it's cutting out everything above it. The same principle here. Now, you probably won't use this near as much as the high pass filter, but it still comes in handy. For example, I use low pass filters all the time on reverbs and delays to roll off the really high frequencies of those return effects so that they don't get in the way of the lead vocal. So those are some of the most common tools that you're going to find on an equalizer. It's very important to understand what they do. Now, I'm going to walk you through the frequency spectrum, everything from 0 to 20 kilohertz. And I'm going to just kind of map out for you a little bit, give you some general guidelines about where different instruments tend to hang out and some things you can do to them to help them to sit properly in the mix. All right, so as I said, I'm not trying to beat the horse to death, but everything below 20 hertz, everything below that, humans can't really hear below 20, so everything below that is kind of useless. So a lot of people on their master mix bus or when mastering, some people will get a sort of a sharp slope here, and they'll just really kind of roll off everything below 20 or 25 even. And maybe widen that slope out a little bit. But because a lot of times down here, it's just useless low-end rumble that you don't need. So this can kind of help clean up your master by rolling off everything below 20. You might can roll that up a little bit more because as you can see, it's not completely cutting out 20, it's just rolling it out. And so that's, you know, everything below 20 is useless, so cut it out on your master mix bus or when you're mastering. If you're doing the mastering yourself, you can feel free to do that. Now the high pass filter, again, actually before we get into that, okay, let's go on up here to 40 hertz. A lot of times 40 hertz in hip hop and rap and stuff, you can get a lot of that sub bass. You know when you're outside and the car comes by and it sounds like the bumper's about to fall off, okay, from all the bass. That's a lot of 40 and 50 and 60 that is causing the bumper to rattle like that. And so a lot of times in hip hop, these frequencies are, you know, they can play a role very much. They're very, very low, but they definitely can be appropriate for those genres. As we move up the frequency spectrum, we start hitting 50 to 60 hertz. This area from 50 to 60 hertz, this is where that thump, that low end thump on your kick drum is going to be, okay? And most of the time in pop and rock and stuff like that, engineers will boost even quite a bit in this area to bring out the thump in that kick drum, okay? And that can really help to just, you know, give you that low end that you're wanting, and you don't really hear the kick that much, but you feel it. You feel that bass from the kick drum. Now, also, as we go up the frequency spectrum, the bass guitar, a sweet spot for the bass guitar a lot of times is between 80 and 100. So you can bring out a lot of warmth and sort of a nice low end with the bass guitar by boosting in this area. And so that's pretty cool. And also your toms, sometimes if you want weightier toms that sound more thunderous, that have more low end, sometimes boosting a little bit in this area, maybe a little bit higher up, sometimes that can help you bring out some of the lower end in your toms if your toms are just too flappy. Now, before we go any higher, I want to revisit our best friend here, the high pass filter, because now we're done talking about the bass, we're done talking about the kick drum for the most part. Now we're going to talk about everything else, and when it comes to everything else, basically you want to roll off with the high pass filter at about 100 hertz or so, because as I said before, you don't want the low end rumble and frequencies from all those different instruments fighting with the bass and the kick drum down here. Okay, so high pass everything that's not playing a role down here in the bass, in the low end, high pass it. You can even go up higher if you need to, and you can see too that with the slope, it's not completely cutting off everything, it's just rolling it off. It doesn't actually completely cut off until like 30 hertz down here, but it's rolling it off so that it's getting it out of the way. Okay, so there's still going to be a little bit left in the low end, but it's going to be turned down drastically so that it's not a problem. High pass filter, your best friend. All right, now let's delete that. This area between actually, let's go on up to 200. 200 can be a notoriously muddy spot on a lot of tracks and in your mix. So sometimes, for example, on the lead vocal, you can get a lot of that chest resonance from the lead vocal in this area. So sometimes it's good to cut a little bit at about 200 to 300, just depending. And that reminds me real quick, how do you know what frequencies to boost or cut? Well, you use a technique that audio engineers use called sweeping, where you create an EQ, or you use an EQ band point, you raise it up real high to like 10 dB, you narrow the Q up, you tighten that up, and then you sweep around the frequency spectrum to sort of find the ugliness that you don't want, that doesn't sound good. And then when you find it, you come back down here and you turn it down a little bit and you widen that Q out back a little bit. And the same thing with if you want to boost, you sweep for the good stuff, you listen for good stuff, and you find something good, you can also boost that as well. But in this example, let's say that I'm sweeping through the lead vocal, and at about 200, I'm really hearing a lot of mud, a lot of chest resonance from the lead singer. Now I can come back down here at 200 and cut 2 or 3 dB, maybe widen that Q out a little bit, and that can really tighten up that lead vocal and help it cut through the mix better. Also, the bass guitar sometimes can get muddy in this area too. From the area from about 200 to 500 is really the muddy area, where a lot of frequencies are going on in this area, and so things can get muddy really quick. So a lot of times it's good to cut on different instruments in this area. A lot of people will cut on the kick drum in this area at like 300 or 350 and stuff like that. They'll cut on the lead vocal, they'll find the mud in the lead vocal and they'll cut it, and they'll find the mud in the bass guitar and they'll cut it. And so a lot of people will cut in this area rather than boost. Having said that, if you've got a snare that sounds thin or weak and it lacks bottom end, a little bit of a boost at about 200 to 300 is normally where the fatness and the weightiness of that snare is found. So you can raise it up a little bit here to bring up a little bit of a fatter, weightier, more low end snare. Now, as we get into the right in the middle of the mid range here, from about 500, 400 to 1K, this is really not a good sounding area. And again, a lot of people will cut in this area. A lot of times the lead vocal will sound very honky in this area, sometimes cutting there. And even on your master mix bus or when mastering, a lot of people, it seems like, will cut a little bit at 500 just because it's not a pleasing area of the frequency spectrum. It just doesn't sound good. Okay, I can't think of a time that I've ever boosted 500. or for that matter 5 to 700. This area just doesn't sound that good. But the thing, a lot of times you can leave it alone, but the thing that you have to realize is that sometimes by cutting in this area on certain things, it helps to accentuate or bring out the low end and also bring out the high end. And a lot of times that's what we're looking for. But a lot of people will cut on the kick drum in this area because you don't really need that crappy sounding mid-range on the kick drum. You want the thump from the low end, and you want a little bit of clickiness on the high end. We'll get to that in a minute, but you don't really want this mid-range on the kick drum, so a lot of people will cut in the mid-range here. And also, again, it just depends on what you're dealing with. Pianos can get muddy at 400 hertz. There's a bass guitar. A lot of things can get honky and muddy sounding in this area, so don't be afraid to cut on things in this area. Now, as we get on up to 1K to about 5K, this is really your high mids, and this is where the clarity and sort of a little bit more of that sizzle and presence is going to be found on a lot of things. And so the intelligibility of the vocals is going to be found in this area from about 2K to 5K. And so if you need to bring out a little bit more of those high mids in the lead vocals to help them pop out in the mix a little bit better, sometimes boosting at like 2 or 3 or 4K, well actually, yeah, 2 to 5K a lot of times can really help with that. Also, you've got sort of your electric guitars, you've got them cutting through in this area as well. You can boost electric guitars in this area to help bring them out a little bit more, but just be careful that you don't have them covering up the lead vocal. You don't want that to happen. Now, so you can also boost on the snare drum at about, anywhere from 2 to 4K to help bring out more snappiness on the snare. So let's say you've got a snare, it's got plenty of weight on it, but you need it to be more snappy. You need it to have a little bit more of a higher pitch to it. You can bring that up at about 2 to 4K, and that'll make your snare sound more snappy. The same thing with the kick drum as well. If you're wanting more click on your kick drum, you can bring that up in this area from about 2 to 5K. You can bring up that click in the kick drum. Now, as we walk up here from about 5K to 20K, this is really your high range here, and you need to be careful about boosting lead vocals in this area from about 5 to 7K, because you can bring up sibilance, you can bring up sibilance, which is too much of that SE sound, or the T's, where the T's and the S's just pop out too much and they annoy the ear. So you need to be careful about boosting too much in this area because it can bring out sibilance. Now, as we progress further up, we're really dealing with our highs here, and you have a lot of the crispiness on the lead vocal up here. You've got the crispiness on the cymbals up here. You don't have much at all from the bass and the kick, obviously. But this can help to polish up your mix. It can help to polish up a track, especially if it's something like a lead vocal. And just as I talked about earlier, a lot of times I'll use a high shelf to sort of give a track or a mix that high end, a little bit of that high end sizzle or that high sheen that just makes it sound more professional, more like something that would be on the radio. And you can, by putting a shelf at about like 8K, for example, and boosting it 2 or 3 dB, you can really help that vocal cut through the mix. And by putting something like this on your master mix bus or in mastering, that can also help to bring out the high end and the sizzle in your mix, which can be helpful. And so other than that, guys, there's not a whole lot going on up here between 10 and 20K. There's just not that much at all going on. This area is generally pretty well behaved. If you've done a good job mixing the tracks and EQing them, a lot of times you don't even have to do much at all in this area. If there's an area that's going to give you problems, it's going to be the low end, and we'll talk about that in future videos. But the low end can be a real pain to deal with getting it right sometimes. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I missed. There's always going to be something that I've missed. Toms, I forgot to mention, toms can get muddy in this area of the mud area. So cutting in this area on the toms can be a good thing sometimes. Just remember, guys, that these are general guidelines. These are not something like you just go to automatically. These are just general guidelines, and it's going to be different for every track and every mix. But I'm just trying to give you a starting point here. So just remember that from everything from 0 to 100 is your low end, and this area from about 200 to 500 is the mud area. A lot of times, as I said before, the mud, the blurriness from tracks will build up in this area, so don't be afraid to cut in this area if you need to. If you've got too much honkiness and that mid-range crappy sound on a track or a mix, you can cut in this area from 500 to 800 really. And then, of course, if you need to bring out presence and clarity in a track or a vocal or something like that, the high mids from about, 2K to 5K can really help with that. And you've got your highs, of course, you can bring out that ultimate high-end sizzle and sheen on your mix and tracks and buses and things like that. So that is a very general overview of EQing, what an equalizer does, what its purpose is. Just remember, guys, that as complicated as it might sound, an equalizer, as I said before, is just a volume adjuster for different frequencies. That's all it is. It just turns up and down certain frequencies, and you can also, of course, filter out frequencies as we talked about before. So it's really simple. The only way to get good at it is to practice and work at it. So good luck. I hope this gives you a starting point, a launching pad, and good luck EQing your tracks and your mix. I wish you the best. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.